Dwayne Johnson, one of America's most renowned actors, found himself caught in an unexpected and tense confrontation at a restaurant. What unfolded next revealed shocking truths and set off a series of events that would leave a deep and lasting impact. Let us know where you're watching from. If you admire the righteous characters in this story, thumbs up and subscribe now. An ordinary meal became an unforgettable moment when Johnson's unwavering calm during a tense encounter delivered a profound lesson in composure and grace. Under the shimmering city lights, the iconic Sunshine restaurant stood as a beacon of luxury. Dwayne Johnson emerged from his sleek black car and entered the upscale establishment, his simple attire a stark contrast to the opulence around him. Patrons cast puzzled, uneasy glances his way, their curiosity piqued as they wondered what brought a casually dressed man into such a luxury restaurant. Dwayne adjusted his baseball cap, pulling it lower as he approached the reception desk at the luxurious Sunshine restaurant. The golden chandeliers sparkled above, casting a warm glow over the elegantly dressed patrons, their designer suits and glamorous evening gowns exuding an air of exclusivity. Dwayne's modest attire, a plain shirt and worn jeans, stood out sharply against the opulent surroundings. As he reached the desk, he spoke in a calm, polite tone. "Could I get a table, please?" Lucy, one of the most seasoned staff members at Sunshine, stood behind the counter. Her years of experience had sharpened her ability to assess guests at a glance, and her eyes quickly scanned him from head to toe. The faintest flicker of disapproval crossed her face, though she maintained a professional posture. To her, his casual appearance screamed out of place. A man like this, here? She thought with a subtle smirk. Suppressing her judgment, Lucy responded with a measured tone, her words carefully polite yet laced with an undertone of skepticism. "Do you have a reservation, sir?" she asked, already assuming the answer. In her mind, Dwayne's appearance didn't belong in the prestigious Sunshine restaurant, and she couldn't help but quietly question why he was here at all. Trying to hide her disdain behind a polished tone, she leaned slightly forward and asked, "Sunshine is one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city. Do you think you can afford to dine here?" Her words were laced with condescension, though she kept her expression neutral enough to pass as polite. Before Dwayne could respond, she added with a faint smirk, "Perhaps the diner at the end of the street might be more suitable for someone like you." Dwayne paused for a moment, his calm demeanor unshaken. "I'd still like a table if possible," he replied, his tone steady but firm. Her sharp eyes, honed from years of serving the city's elite, scanned him with a mix of disapproval. She smirked faintly, her thoughts betraying her professional demeanor. What is someone like this doing here? To Lucy, Dwayne's casual appearance was almost offensive, a glaring violation of the exclusivity and sophistication the restaurant prided itself on. Lucy hesitated, her instinct to decline masked by her obligation to remain professional. With a forced smile, she said, "Follow me, sir." Her tone tinged with reluctance. She led him to the darkest, most inconspicuous corner of the restaurant, far from the shimmering chandeliers and elegant ambience. The table was tucked near the kitchen door, where the clatter of dishes and the hum of staff chatter created a constant din. To Lucy, it was the perfect spot for someone who didn't fit the restaurant's polished image. Dwayne remained calm, unfazed by Lucy's thinly veiled disdain. He gave her a polite nod and quietly followed her to the dimly lit table near the kitchen door. Sitting down without a hint of frustration, his composed demeanor seemed almost out of place in the tension-filled moment, as though he were silently observing and waiting. Settling into his seat, Dwayne glanced around the bustling restaurant, then back at Lucy with a calm, unreadable expression. He made no complaint, his posture relaxed yet firm, as if to say he was prepared to see how far her judgment would carry her actions. Lucy glanced at Dwayne as he settled into the dimly lit table near the kitchen door. Inwardly, she thought to herself, he must realize this corner suits him perfectly. A faint, smug smile crossed her lips as she turned away to fetch the menu, a highlight that proves the class of this restaurant. Walking back, the weight of the leather-bound menu in her hands felt symbolic, almost as though she were delivering a verdict. She placed it in front of Dwayne with a practiced smile that barely hid her condescension. "Here's our menu, sir," she said, her tone dripping with politeness. Though her thoughts told a different story, Lucy stepped back, folding her arms and observing discreetly as Dwayne opened the menu. She knew what was coming. The elegantly designed pages, adorned with fine dining selections and eye-watering prices, had sent many unprepared guests scrambling for the exit. The moment he sees those prices, she thought smugly, he'll realize this isn't a place for someone like him. He'll stand up, apologize awkwardly, and walk out that door. Then he'll understand this isn't his world. But to her surprise, Dwayne remained calm, scanning the menu without a hint of hesitation, leaving Lucy silently questioning her assumptions. Dwayne opened the luxurious leather-bound menu, its gilded pages radiating exclusivity and opulence. His calm eyes scanned the extravagant offerings as if the jaw-dropping prices didn't faze him in the slightest. After a brief pause, he looked up at Lucy, who stood with her notepad, waiting expectantly but skeptically. In a composed and gentle tone, he began to order. "I'll start with the caviar platter," Dwayne said smoothly. "For the main course, the Wagyu steak with truffle butter. And for wine, let's pair that with the vintage Chateau Margaux." Lucy's pen froze for a split second as her brain processed what she had just heard. She forced her lips into a polite smile, but her mind was screaming with disbelief. Oh, really? This guy, dressed like he just came from a backyard barbecue, is ordering our most expensive dishes? Does he even know what he's saying? Or is he just trying to impress himself? She cleared her throat and responded, "An excellent choice, sir," her voice dripping with faux politeness. But her eyes gave her away, glinting with thinly veiled mockery. As she jotted down his order, she couldn't resist adding, "You do realize the Chateau Margaux is one of the finest and priciest wines we offer, correct? Not many guests are bold enough to try it." Her tone was laced with sarcasm, as though she were daring him to back out. Dwayne nodded calmly, unfazed. "Sounds perfect," he replied, his voice steady and assured. Lucy let out a small, condescending chuckle under her breath. "Perfect? We'll see how perfect he thinks it is when the bill arrives," she thought smugly. She imagined the moment he realized he couldn't afford it, awkwardly scrambling to explain himself before slinking out the door in embarrassment. As Dwayne calmly sat at his dimly lit table, tucked away near the bustling kitchen, the sounds of clinking dishes and muffled conversations filled the air. Unbothered by his less-than-stellar seating arrangement or Lucy's condescending treatment, heading toward the restroom with the same composed demeanor he'd maintained all evening. On his way, the luxurious interior of Sunshine glimmered under the golden chandeliers. The room buzzed with chatter, patrons dressed in designer suits and gowns, oblivious to his understated presence. Just as he reached the restroom corridor, a sharply dressed young man, holding a cocktail glass in one hand, stumbled out of the restroom and brushed roughly against Dwayne's arm. The man, barely in his late 20s, paused and gave Dwayne a once-over, his gaze dripping with disdain. His lips curled into a mocking smirk as he adjusted his cufflinks, clearly unimpressed by the plain shirt and worn jeans Dwayne was wearing. "Do you even know who I am?" he sneered, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby patrons. "My father is the chairman of the largest manufacturing company in the country. People like you shouldn't even be allowed in a place like this." Several heads turned toward the commotion, curious about the scene unfolding in the corridor. The young man, emboldened by the growing attention, took a step closer, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Seriously, look at you," he spat. "What makes you think you belong here? This is a place for the elite, not whatever it is you are. Why don't you do yourself a favor and get out of here? Go back to whatever corner you crawled out of." Dwayne stood motionless, his broad frame towering over the smaller man, yet his expression remained calm and unshaken. His steady gaze locked onto the young man, who appeared increasingly irritated by Dwayne's lack of response. The air was tense, the silence amplifying the arrogance of the man's words. Despite the provocation, Dwayne didn't raise his voice or show any hint of anger. Instead, he simply tilted his head slightly, offering a faint, composed smile that seemed to disarm the tension rather than fuel it. "I apologize if I got in your way," Dwayne said in an even tone, his voice calm but carrying a weight that silenced the corridor. "I didn't mean to disturb you." As Dwayne made his way back to his seat, the young man, still seething with arrogance, seemed unable to let the situation go. His eyes narrowed as he turned toward Dwayne once more, his frustration boiling over into outright fury. The soft murmur of nearby conversations began to fade as heads turned to watch the escalating confrontation. The young man barked, his voice louder this time, cutting through the air and drawing even more attention. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? You think you can just walk in here, dressed like that, and act like you belong?" Dwayne stopped in his tracks and turned to face the man, his calm expression unchanged. He didn't say anything, his silence only seeming to further infuriate the young man. The brash figure took a step closer, his voice rising as if trying to establish dominance. "What's the matter? Nothing to say? When you walked into this restaurant, you already ruined my night. Don't tell me it wasn't intentional. Just get out of here. That's the best way to fix this." The young man's arrogance, fueled by his inflated sense of self-worth, reached new heights as he closed the distance between them. His chest puffed out, his posture rigid with a sense of superiority. "People like you don't deserve to breathe the same air as us," he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. Without warning, he raised his hand and shoved Dwayne's shoulder, attempting to push him back, though the effort lacked real force. It was clear the young man wasn't trying to hide his contempt. It wasn't just a physical shove, it was a symbolic gesture, an attempt to assert his perceived dominance, as if his wealth and family name gave him the right to stand above everyone else. Dwayne didn't flinch. His towering frame absorbed the push as if it had never happened. His expression remained composed, unshaken by the man's escalating aggression. A few gasps echoed from the growing crowd of onlookers, some visibly uncomfortable with the young man's behavior. "Is that all you've got?" Dwayne finally said, his voice calm and steady. His tone wasn't confrontational, but there was an undeniable weight to it, firm, grounded, and in complete control of the situation. He didn't raise his voice, but it carried enough authority to quiet the room for a brief moment. The young man hesitated, clearly not expecting such a composed response. For a fleeting second, uncertainty flashed across his face, but he quickly buried it beneath a mask of anger. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" he spat, taking another step closer. "You don't belong here, and I'll make sure you understand that." Despite the man's continued outburst, Dwayne didn't waver. His calm presence seemed almost impenetrable, like a mountain standing firm against a storm. He didn't react to the insults or the push. Instead, he stood tall, exuding quiet strength and restraint. Around them, the restaurant staff and patrons exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of whether to intervene or let the scene play out. But Dwayne's silence wasn't submission, it was control. And in that silence, the young man's bluster began to feel hollow, his attempts to assert dominance crumbling under the weight of Dwayne's unshakable composure. Around them, curious eyes remained fixed on the unfolding confrontation. Most of the patrons, dressed in their finest attire, stood by, uninterested in intervening. Their expressions were filled more with intrigue and amusement than with any sense of justice or desire to protect the vulnerable. To them, this was little more than an unexpected bit of entertainment in their otherwise elegant evening. The concept of fairness seemed a distant concern, drowned out by their fascination with the drama playing out before them. But not everyone chose silence. Among the onlookers was a young woman seated nearby with her friend. She had been observing everything from the start, from the way the server, Lucy, had treated Dwayne with cold disdain to how the young man was now openly mocking and provoking him simply because of the clothes he was wearing. Unable to remain silent any longer, she stood up, her initial nervousness replaced by a steely resolve. Stepping forward, she raised her voice, clear and firm, cutting through the tense atmosphere. "Everyone deserves respect and to be treated with basic decency," she said, her gaze fixed on the arrogant young man. "You have no right to insult or demean someone just because of their appearance. And it's even worse that so many of you are just standing here, watching this happen without saying a word." Her words hung in the air, and the room seemed to freeze. The attention of the crowd, which had been glued to Dwayne and his aggressor, now shifted to her. Some exchanged uneasy glances, as if questioning their own inaction, while others looked away, uncomfortable with the sudden call-out. The young man, stunned by her unexpected courage, quickly regained his composure and sneered. "You don't understand what's going on here," he snapped. "Mind your own business. This has nothing to do with you." But she didn't back down. "Respecting others is everyone's business," she said firmly, her voice unwavering. "You think you're better than him because of your money or your family name. But true strength doesn't come from belittling others. It comes from lifting people up, not tearing them down. If you really believe you're so superior, then act like it." Her words struck a chord, silencing even the most curious onlookers. For a moment, the young man hesitated, his bravado faltering under the weight of her conviction and the growing discomfort in the room. Dwayne, who had remained calm and composed throughout, looked at her and gave a slight nod, a faint but genuine smile crossing his face as if to thank her silently. The tension in the room grew heavier as the young man's friend stepped forward, a smug smirk on his face as he looked Dwayne up and down. His eyes then darted to the young woman who had bravely stood up moments earlier, and his tone, "Oh, listen to her," he sneered, gesturing toward the woman. "The way she's defending him. It's almost like she sees herself in him. Maybe because she does. Maybe because they're both cut from the same cloth, cheap, tattered, and completely out of place in a place like this." His words, sharp and biting, filled the room with unease, though the surrounding patrons continued to watch silently, their curiosity. The young woman clenched her fists but kept her composure. "You can mock me all you want," she said firmly, "but everyone deserves to be treated with respect. That includes him." Her response only fueled the man's arrogance. He laughed harshly and pointed at Dwayne. "Respect? You think he deserves respect? Look at him. He doesn't belong here, and neither do you. If you're so determined to defend him, why don't the two of you leave? This isn't a place for charity cases or sob stories." Dwayne remained silent, his calm demeanor intact despite the man's cutting words. His broad shoulders and composed posture stood in stark contrast to the growing aggression of the two young men. And then Lucy, the server who had earlier treated Dwayne with disdain, suddenly stepped forward. It was as though she had been holding back her true feelings and could no longer contain herself. Her voice, sharp and bitter, cut through the room. "He's right," Lucy said, her arms crossed as she glared at Dwayne. "You don't belong here. You walk in here without a reservation, dressed like that, and expect us to treat you like everyone else? Do you even realize where you are? This isn't some corner diner where you can just stroll in like you own the place." She turned to the crowd, her voice growing louder as she tried to rally them to her side. "Look at him," she exclaimed, gesturing toward Dwayne. "Does he look like someone who can afford to dine here? I've been working at Sunshine for years, and I've seen people from all walks of life, but I've never seen someone so out of place." Dwayne didn't say a word. He simply stood there, his steady gaze fixed on Lucy. But her words didn't stop. "You've been nothing but trouble since you walked in," she continued, her voice rising with every word. "And now you've got people defending you, like you're some kind of victim. But the truth is, you don't belong here, and everyone knows it." The young man and his friend laughed, their confidence bolstered by Lucy's outburst. "See," the friend said, smirking, "even the staff knows you don't belong. Why don't you save yourself the embarrassment and leave before you're thrown out?" The young woman stepped forward again, her voice trembling but resolute. "You all keep talking about who belongs here and who doesn't, but none of you seem to realize how ugly you're making this place. It's not him who doesn't belong, it's the cruelty and arrogance coming from you." Her words, though powerful, did little to sway the group. Lucy rolled her eyes, and the young men continued to snicker. Dwayne, still calm, looked at the young woman and gave her a small nod of gratitude before taking a step back, choosing not to engage further. The room buzzed with whispers and judgmental stares, and though Dwayne remained composed, the weight of the situation pressed heavily on him. For now, he chose to stay silent, letting his actions speak louder than words in the face of their mockery. The tension in the restaurant was now palpable. The young man and his friend, emboldened by Lucy's outburst, continued their mockery, their voices louder, their words sharper. The young woman stood her ground, but the cruelty in the air was suffocating, and the silence of the onlookers only seemed to fuel the arrogance of the pair. The friend smirked, his gaze shifting back to Dwayne, who remained composed despite the verbal onslaught. "What's the matter? Nothing to say?" he taunted, his voice dripping with mockery. "Maybe you finally realized we're right. This isn't your world. You're just a nobody trying to pretend you belong here." The other young man laughed loudly, slapping his friend on the shoulder. Maybe he thought if he ordered the most expensive dishes, we'd believe he's somebody important. He sneered. "Newsflash, pal, money doesn't buy class, and you're clearly out of your depth. Honestly, it's pathetic." Lucy, who had stepped aside briefly, rejoined with her own sneer. "Pathetic is putting it lightly," she said, her tone icy. "What's sad is that he actually stayed. If I were in his shoes, I'd have the sense to leave before making an even bigger fool of myself. But I guess some people just don't know when to quit." The laughter of the two young men echoed through the room, blending with Lucy's biting words. Around them, the other patrons exchanged whispers, some shaking their heads, others merely watching in silence, their expressions a mix of discomfort and intrigue. No one moved to intervene, their curiosity keeping them rooted to their spots like spectators at a performance. The young woman who had defended Dwayne earlier clenched her fists, her voice trembling with frustration. "How can you all stand there and laugh?" she snapped, her voice cutting through the laughter. "This isn't just cruel, it's disgusting. You're humiliating a man who hasn't done a single thing to deserve it. Is this what makes you feel powerful?" Her words hung in the air for a moment, but they only seemed to amuse the young men further. "Oh, look at her," one of them said, his voice mockingly sweet, defending her knight in shining armor. "How touching. Maybe they're a match made in heaven, two nobodies who think they're something." Lucy snickered, folding her arms. "Maybe they should take their act elsewhere. This is sunshine, not a charity case reunion." Honestly, it's embarrassing. Just as the taunts seemed to reach their peak, a subtle movement caught Dwayne's eye. A young man, standing near the back of the crowd, had quietly pulled out his phone and was recording the entire scene. His expression was unreadable, but there was a glint in his eyes, a mix of curiosity and quiet determination. He wasn't just filming for the sake of it. He knew what he was capturing would speak volumes. As the two men and Lucy continued their cruel tirade, the young man with the phone stood still, his camera steady. In his mind, he could already see the headline, "Elitists humiliate strangers in high-end restaurant." He didn't know who Dwayne was, but he could sense that this video would do more than just expose the cruelty. It would shine a spotlight on a man who, despite being outnumbered and insulted, had held his ground with dignity. Dwayne, catching the man's gaze briefly, gave him a small nod. He then turned back, his calm expression unchanged. Though the insults kept coming, Dwayne's silence was louder than their words, and the quiet resolve in his eyes hinted at something far greater than anyone in the room realized. The room buzzed with tension, the laughter and mocking voices of the young man, his friend, and Lucy echoing louder than ever. Dwayne had remained calm, silently enduring their cruel taunts. But now, as the arrogance in the room reached its boiling point, he finally spoke. With a voice steady yet commanding, Dwayne broke the tension. "Enough." The single word cut through the noise, silencing the room. All eyes turned to him, their curiosity now mixed with a sense of unease. He took a step forward, towering over the young man and his friend, his calm composure contrasting sharply with their smug expressions. "You've said a lot tonight," Dwayne began, his tone even, but with an edge that made it clear he was done tolerating their behavior. "You've judged me, insulted me, and humiliated me, all based on what? The clothes I'm wearing? The fact that I don't look like you?" The young man scoffed, trying to regain his bravado. "And? Are we wrong? Look around you. You don't belong here." Dwayne tilted his head slightly, a faint smile playing on his lips, though his eyes were sharp. "Don't I?" he said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made the young man hesitate. "Tell me something. What exactly gives you the right to decide who belongs here? Is it your money? Your family name?" The young man straightened, his arrogance flaring back. "My father runs the biggest manufacturing company in the country. That's why. People like you." Dwayne raised a hand, cutting him off. "Your father?" he repeated, his voice steady. "That's impressive. But let me tell you something, kid." He paused, letting the weight of his words build. "You're standing in my restaurant." The room froze. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as the realization began to sink in. The young man's smug expression faltered, his eyes widening in disbelief. What did you just say?" he stammered, his voice suddenly weaker. Dwayne took another step forward, his presence commanding the room. "I said, this is my restaurant," he repeated, his voice firm. "The deed, the name, the walls you're leaning on, all of it belongs to me. I built this place from the ground up. And while you're busy riding on your father's success, I earned mine with my own 2 hands." The young man's friend tried to interject, his voice shaking with nervousness. "You're lying. There's no way." "Do I look like I'm lying?" Dwayne interrupted, his gaze locking onto him. "You judged me the moment I walked in because I wasn't dressed like you, because I didn't fit into your idea of what someone who belongs here looks like. But let me make one thing clear. The only person here who has the authority to tell someone to leave is me." The young man opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He glanced around the room, searching for support, but the other patrons were now whispering among themselves, their earlier judgment of Dwayne replaced with shock and unease. Dwayne stepped closer, his voice lowering but carrying an even greater intensity. "So, if anyone here doesn't belong, it's someone who uses their father's name to throw their weight around. Someone who thinks their money gives them the right to belittle others. That's not class. That's entitlement." The young man's face turned pale, his earlier confidence completely shattered. He took a small step back, his arrogance now replaced with embarrassment. The room remained silent, every eye fixed on Dwayne, who stood tall and unwavering. "I suggest you think carefully before you speak again," Dwayne said, his voice calm but final. "Because this restaurant welcomes everyone who treats others with respect. And if you can't manage that, then you're the one who doesn't belong here." The silence in the restaurant was deafening. All eyes remained glued to Dwayne, whose calm yet commanding revelation left the room in stunned disbelief. The 2 young men, their earlier arrogance shattered, stood frozen, their faces pale and their confidence crumbled. But it wasn't just them. Lucy, the seasoned server who had openly mocked Dwayne all evening, was equally shaken. Her jaw tightened as she stared at him, her mind racing. Could he really be the owner? She wondered, her disbelief battling against the weight of his words. She'd worked at Sunshine for years, always hearing that the owner was a private, elusive figure. But there was no way the man standing before her, in his plain shirt and faded jeans, could be the same person. It was impossible, or at least, it should have been. Her shock quickly turned into anger, her pride refusing to let her accept what he'd said. "No," she thought. "He's lying. He has to be." Summoning her courage, Lucy stepped forward, her voice sharp and accusatory. "You're saying you're the owner?" she asked, her tone dripping with skepticism. "I've worked here for years, and not once have I seen you or even heard your name mentioned. Do you expect me to believe that you, a man who walked in here looking like he got lost on his way to a diner, are the owner of one of the most prestigious restaurants in the city?" Dwayne turned to her, his expression calm, his gaze steady. But Lucy wasn't finished. Her voice grew louder, laced with scorn as she tried to rally the room back to her side. "This is ridiculous," she scoffed. "You think you can walk in here, claim to be someone important, and expect us to believe you just because you say so? You're not fooling anyone. Lying doesn't make you part of the upper class. It just makes you desperate." Her words echoed through the room, but the crowd remained silent, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. Lucy's frustration mounted as she realized she wasn't getting the reaction she expected. She glanced around, her confidence faltering slightly as she noticed some patrons whispering among themselves, their eyes filled with doubt, not in Dwayne, but in her. Dwayne took a step closer, his calm presence only amplifying the tension. He looked at Lucy, his expression unwavering, When he finally spoke, his voice was low but firm, carrying a weight that silenced even her. "You've been here for years, Lucy," he said, his tone measured. "And yet, in all that time, it seems you never learned the most important part of your job." Lucy blinked, taken aback. "And what's that supposed to mean?" she snapped. Though her voice trembled slightly, Dwayne held her gaze, his expression softening just enough to show a hint of disappointment. "Respect," he said simply. "Respect for the people who walk through these doors, no matter who they are or what they look like. That's what this restaurant is supposed to stand for. That's what I built it to be." Lucy's face turned red, a mix of anger and embarrassment washing over her. The room remained silent, every eye on her as she struggled to find a response. But before she could speak, Dwayne added, his voice still calm but unyielding, "You may have worked here for years, but tonight you've shown me that you don't understand what Sunshine is really about, and that's something I can't overlook." The weight of his words hung in the air as Lucy stood frozen, her earlier confidence completely shattered. For the first time that evening, she had no words, and the room waited in tense silence to see what would happen next. Dwayne remained calm, standing tall amidst the tension that had overtaken the luxurious restaurant. The mocking voices, the skeptical stares, and Lucy's pointed accusations all swirled around him. But he was unshaken. Instead of retaliating with words, he simply reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The room watched in stunned silence, their whispers dying down as he calmly dialed a number. His composure, sharp and deliberate, seemed to command the very air in the room. "Yes, it's me," he said into the phone, his voice steady yet firm. "I'm at Sunshine right now. Please connect me to the manager immediately. Let them know their boss is here." On the other end, the person on the line acknowledged his request with urgency. Dwayne hung up, slipping the phone back into his pocket with a controlled, deliberate motion. The weight of his words seemed to hang in the air, leaving everyone in the room, even the two young men and Lucy, unsure of how to react. Dwayne said nothing further, simply standing there, his steady presence unnerving those who had mocked him just moments before. Minutes later, the restaurant's manager, a middle-aged man in a crisp black suit, entered the room hastily. He had just returned from overseeing an extravagant outdoor party for a high-profile client, his mind still preoccupied with its success. His polished appearance was slightly disheveled, his tie loosened, and his expression carried the exhaustion of a long evening. But as soon as he stepped into the dining area, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Pulling it out, his face changed completely upon reading the message. "Mr. Johnson is here." The manager froze for a brief moment before his eyes scanned the room, searching for the man he now realized was his employer. When he spotted Dwayne standing near the center of the restaurant, surrounded by an uneasy crowd, his face paled, and his posture immediately straightened. His mind raced, confused and mortified. He hadn't been informed of Dwayne's visit, something that should never have been overlooked. With brisk steps, the manager approached Dwayne, stopping a few feet away and bowing his head slightly in respect. "Mr. Johnson," he said, his voice laced with both surprise and apology. "I had no idea you would be joining us tonight. Please forgive me. I was overseeing the outdoor event and wasn't made aware of your arrival." The room erupted in hushed gasps as the revelation hit the patrons like a tidal wave. The murmurs grew louder, people now realizing the gravity of the situation. Lucy, who had been standing stiffly nearby, looked completely stunned. Her confidence, so apparent moments earlier, evaporated as she stared at Dwayne in disbelief. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. Dwayne gave the manager a small nod, his expression calm but firm. "It seems there's been some misunderstanding," he said evenly, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "I've been treated poorly since I walked in. That's something I'll want to address later. For now, I'd like you to confirm to your staff exactly who I am." The manager turned toward the staff, his expression stern as he glanced at Lucy, whose face had turned pale. "Everyone, please listen," he said, his voice sharp. "This man is Mr. Johnson, the owner of Sunshine. He built this restaurant, and it exists today because of him." The room fell into a heavy silence. the earlier ridicule and judgment replaced with shock and discomfort. Lucy staggered back a step, her hands trembling slightly as she realized the full weight of her mistake. The young men, too, looked at each other in disbelief, their arrogance utterly shattered. Meanwhile, Dwayne stood in the middle of it all, composed and dignified, his silence speaking louder than words. As the manager's announcement settled over the room, the atmosphere grew heavier with tension. The murmurs among the patrons grew louder, whispers of disbelief and embarrassment filling the luxurious restaurant. All eyes turned toward Dwayne, the man who had been silently enduring mockery and humiliation, now revealed as the true owner of Sunshine. The two young men, who had been the loudest and cruelest in their ridicule, suddenly found themselves at the center of the crowd's judgment. The first young man, who had boasted about his father's company and his perceived superiority, shifted uncomfortably. His once arrogant posture was now slouched, and his face had turned pale. His friend, equally shaken, tried to regain some semblance of composure. "I didn't know," the first young man stammered, his voice trembling as he addressed Dwayne. "If I had known you were the owner." Dwayne raised his hand, cutting him off. His expression remained calm but firm, his piercing gaze leaving no room for excuses. "You didn't need to know who I was to treat me with respect," he said, his voice steady yet carrying a quiet authority that silenced the room. "Respect isn't about someone's title or their clothes. It's about how you treat every person you meet, regardless of who they are." The young man opened his mouth to respond but quickly closed it, realizing there was nothing he could say to defend himself. Dwayne turned to the manager, who stood nearby, his hands clasped nervously. "These two," Dwayne said, nodding toward the young men, "are to leave the restaurant immediately. Their behavior tonight is unacceptable and goes against everything this establishment stands for." The manager nodded quickly, his professional demeanor returning as he stepped forward. "Gentlemen," he said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument, "you are no longer welcome here. Please gather your belongings and leave." The young men exchanged panicked glances, their earlier confidence completely gone. They hesitated, as if hoping someone might intervene on their behalf. But the silent stares of the other patrons made it clear that no one would. Finally, with reluctant steps, they began to make their way toward the exit. Their heads hung low. As they passed by Dwayne, one of them muttered, "I'm sorry," though his voice was barely audible. Dwayne didn't respond, his expression remaining composed as he watched them leave. The room remained silent, the tension thick as everyone processed what had just happened. But the evening's reckoning wasn't over yet. Dwayne turned his attention to Lucy, who stood frozen in place, her earlier defiance now replaced with visible fear. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she avoided meeting his gaze. The manager looked at her, his jaw tightening as he awaited Dwayne's decision. "Lucy," Dwayne began, his voice calm but unyielding. She flinched slightly at the sound of her name. "You've worked here for years, haven't you?" "Yes, sir," she replied softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "And in those years, you've served countless guests, many of whom you likely didn't know by name or status." Dwayne continued, "Yet tonight, you decided that someone's appearance was enough to justify treating them with disdain and disrespect. You not only mocked me but encouraged others to do the same, creating an atmosphere of cruelty in a place meant to offer warmth and hospitality." Lucy opened her mouth to respond, but Dwayne held up his hand, silencing her. "There's no excuse for your behavior," he said firmly. "As someone who has worked here for so long, you should have known better. Effective immediately. Your employment here is terminated." The words hit Lucy like a thunderclap. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked as though she might plead for forgiveness. But the finality in Dwayne's tone left no room for negotiation. Lowering her head, she nodded slightly, her voice shaking as she said, "I understand." She turned and began to walk toward the back of the restaurant, her steps slow and heavy. The room remained silent, the weight of Dwayne's decision hanging in the air. But his gaze wasn't finished sweeping the room. Dwayne turned toward the other servers who had been present during the evening. Many of them had stayed silent as the events unfolded, either out of fear or apathy. and now stood with their heads bowed, avoiding his eyes. "You," Dwayne said, addressing them directly, "may not have participated in what happened tonight, but your silence made you complicit. As staff of this restaurant, it is your responsibility to ensure that every guest is treated with respect and dignity. Allowing such behavior to continue unchecked is a failure of your duty." The servers exchanged uneasy glances, guilt written across their faces. Dwayne's tone softened slightly, but the weight of his words remained. This restaurant was built to be a place where everyone, no matter their background, appearance, or status, feels welcome. Tonight, you let that vision be tarnished. He looked at the manager, who nodded in understanding. "All staff members who were present tonight will be issued a fine," the manager said firmly. "It will serve as a reminder of the standards we hold at Sunshine." The servers nodded, their expressions filled with a mix of shame and regret. Dwayne stepped back, his eyes scanning the room one final time. The patrons, who had been mere spectators to the events, now seemed to shrink under his gaze. Some looked down at their plates, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Finally, Dwayne spoke again, his voice steady and calm. "Let tonight serve as a lesson," he said, addressing everyone in the room. "Kindness and respect are not optional. They're the foundation of this restaurant and everything it stands for. I hope that the next time any of you find yourselves in a similar situation, you choose to act differently." With that, he gave a small nod to the manager and returned to his table, the weight of his presence lingering in the air. The room remained silent, the gravity of the night's events etched into everyone's minds. Sunshine, once a place of judgment and cruelty that evening, had been reminded of the values it was meant to embody and the quiet strength of the man who had built it. The morning sunlight filtered through the windows of Dwayne's office as he sat at his desk, the events of the previous night still fresh in his mind. The echoes of mocking voices and the stares of silent patrons played over in his thoughts, but he was calm. As always, he wasn't a man to dwell on anger or resentment. Instead, Dwayne channeled his focus into solutions, determined to ensure that the culture of respect and hospitality he envisioned for his restaurant chain would never be compromised again. His phone rang, breaking his concentration. It was the manager of the Sunset restaurant chain, the person responsible for overseeing all the locations under Dwayne's ownership. Dwayne picked up the call, his tone steady but purposeful. "Good morning," he began. "I'd like to discuss something important regarding the entire Sunset system." The manager, still reeling from the news of the previous evening, responded hesitantly. "Of course, Mr. Johnson. How can I assist you?" Dwayne leaned forward, his voice firm yet calm. "Last night was unacceptable. It wasn't just one individual's failure, it was a systemic issue. The culture at that restaurant allowed disrespect, judgment, and cruelty to go unchecked. This isn't just about Sunshine. It's about every restaurant in the Sunset chain. I want immediate action to ensure this never happens again." The manager nodded, though Dwayne couldn't see him. "I understand. Sir, what do you propose?" Dwayne paused, carefully choosing his words. "We need to implement a comprehensive training program across all our restaurants. A program that focuses not just on basic customer service, but on empathy, respect, and understanding. Every single employee, from servers to managers, will be required to participate." The manager hesitated. "That's a significant undertaking, sir. It will require resources, time, and it's worth every effort." Dwayne interjected, his tone resolute. "This isn't just about protecting the reputation of the Sunset brand. It's about creating an environment where every guest feels valued, regardless of who they are or what they look like. It's about redefining what hospitality truly means." The manager took a deep breath. "Understood, sir. I'll begin organizing the logistics." But Dwayne wasn't done. "This training needs to be more than a lecture or a checklist. I want it to be interactive and impactful. Bring in experts, hospitality professionals, diversity and inclusion specialists, even psychologists if needed. I want every employee to understand the importance of treating every guest with dignity, no matter their background." The manager nodded again. "I'll make the necessary arrangements." Dwayne leaned back in his chair, his expression softening slightly. "One more thing," he said. "This training shouldn't just be a one-time event. I want it to be an ongoing program, something that every new hire goes through and something we revisit regularly. It's not enough to talk about these values once. They need to be woven into the fabric of our organization." The manager's voice grew more confident. "I'll make it happen, sir. When would you like to begin?" "As soon as possible," Dwayne replied. "Start coordinating with your team today. I want every manager across the chain to be on the same page. Schedule the first sessions within the next 2 weeks." With the call concluded, Dwayne set the phone down and took a moment to reflect. He knew this initiative wouldn't erase the events of the previous night, but it was a start, a step toward ensuring that no guest would ever feel the way he had in his own restaurant. 2 weeks later, the training program launched at Sunshine and across every Sunset location. The first session took place in the same restaurant where the incident had occurred. Employees gathered in the private dining room, their faces a mix of curiosity, nervousness, and even skepticism. At the front of the room stood a team of trainers, including a renowned hospitality consultant, a diversity and inclusion specialist, and Dwayne himself. Dwayne opened the session, his calm yet authoritative presence commanding attention. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady but firm. "What happened here 2 weeks ago was unacceptable. It went against everything this restaurant and this brand are supposed to stand for. But instead of focusing on the past, we're here to learn and move forward." He paused, letting his words sink in. This training isn't about punishment. It's about growth. It's about understanding that hospitality isn't just about serving food or taking orders. It's about making people feel valued, respected, and welcome, no matter who they are. The consultant stepped in next, leading the group through a series of exercises designed to challenge their assumptions and biases. One activity involved role-playing scenarios where employees had to step into the shoes of a guest facing judgment or mistreatment. Another focused on identifying unconscious biases and understanding how they could influence behavior. The diversity and inclusion specialist then took the stage, sharing stories and data that highlighted the importance of treating every individual with dignity. "We all come from different backgrounds," she said, her voice warm yet firm. "But at the end of the day, we're all human, and the way we treat each other defines who we are, not just as employees, but as people." The employees listened intently, many of them visibly moved by the stories and exercises. Some shared their own experiences, while others admitted to moments where they had judged others unfairly. It was a humbling experience, one that left many of them reevaluating their actions and attitudes. As the training session came to a close, Dwayne stepped forward once more. "This is just the beginning," he said. "What you've learned today isn't something you leave behind when you walk out of this room. It's something you carry with you every day, in every interaction. This is the culture we're building at Sunset, a culture of respect, kindness, and inclusion." The room erupted into applause, a sign of both understanding and commitment. Over the following weeks, similar sessions were held at every Sunset location, each one reinforcing the values Dwayne had worked so hard to instill. Slowly but surely, the culture of the brand began to shift, driven by the lessons learned from that one fateful evening. For Dwayne, it wasn't just about fixing a mistake, it was about creating something better, something lasting. And as he walked out of the restaurant that day, he felt a quiet sense of pride, knowing that the change he had set in motion would ripple far beyond the walls of Sunshine. After weeks of intensive training, the culture within the Sunset restaurant chain began to transform. The lessons learned from the sessions weren't just theoretical, they became a living, breathing part of daily operations. Employees now approached their roles with a renewed sense of purpose, understanding that hospitality wasn't merely about delivering excellent service, but about fostering respect, kindness, and inclusivity. Servers greeted every guest with genuine warmth, regardless of their attire, background, or perceived status. Conversations among staff shifted, moving away from judgmental whispers to collaborative discussions about how to enhance the guest experience. The training had instilled a sense of empathy that radiated through every interaction, Guests who once might have felt out of place in such a luxurious setting now found themselves welcomed as though they belonged, because they did. The changes didn't go unnoticed. Patrons began to praise not only the food, but also the atmosphere, describing it as more inviting and human. Reviews highlighted how the staff made them feel valued and respected, creating an environment where luxury didn't feel intimidating but inclusive. For Dwayne, this shift was a testament to the power of respect. He often reminded his team, respect isn't just a policy, it's a choice we make every day. And when we choose it, we elevate not only ourselves, but everyone around us. The training had become more than a program. It was the foundation for a legacy of kindness and dignity that would define the Sunset brand for years to come.